It's healthy to remember that if we can remove pride, we can remove all vices. It is the source of all vices. So I hope that we can realize now the torture that living in pride is. It is not for me to identify the sin in our lives, but I assure you a rich and rewarding life awaits for he who recognizes his sole purpose in the universe. We'll talk more later about how we can remove it and what the opposite virtue of humility means. But to begin, it has much to do with motivation. And this motivation is the joy of the intended life of the Creator. So we must choose to live, to race the race set out before us by faith. We must choose to live in spite of the hard things in life. We must remember that we suffer because he loves and accepts us. The second book of Corinthians puts it this way: "That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults and hardships, in persecutions and difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong." So God's ultimate plan is intended for you. It's personable, it's real. There's a humility in not understanding our suffering and not trying to, but remembering who God is and how he has created our lives. What can be so difficult about this, though, is that there's a trust that requires the breaking of our pride in order that we might further break down our pride and find that true life. So we must respond to this paradigm with prayer and understanding, that we may soon see how sin is death, and a desire within us may grow to eradicate the sin in our lives. That repentance, even with all its pain and disbelief, would produce life within us, whether or not we have been a believer or are just becoming a believer. So we can choose to be holy in the life that we want to live. So humility is an alternative lifestyle. It's necessary in order to race the race that God has set out before us. I hope this morning that the scriptures can convince us to break our pride and to realize the death that it brings within us. But I think this is an atypical persuasion, more of a warning. If we think of pride as a game, humility isn't just not playing the game. It's choosing to lose. It's losing the competition on purpose in hopes that others might win and be themselves honored, but ultimately God would be glorified. Humility is not just apathy, it's an active opposite of pride. It involves the intentional giving of oneself away all the time, all completely. This leads us to another paradox, because we need to think about ourselves less and less, but at the same time, we're thinking of ourselves more and more as we're thinking about how we can remove ourselves. So this eventually difficulty lies in simultaneously forgetting about oneself, but also loving God and loving others, seeking his will, and actively recognizing the filth of our pride in our own lives. This dynamic balance is rarely understood and is so much more of a struggle fought always than a temptation ever conquered. So we need to identify with and rely on our cloud of witnesses, this great cloud of witnesses before us, that we may, as believers, may just as quickly scorn our pride as Christ did his shame when he sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. The second chapter of Philippians says, "Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interests of others." So we can look at Jesus' example as we discern what humility means in our lives, and we can see how he had the right to glory, but he chose a lower form of humanity instead. He then even became obedient to death. He obeyed. So when we talk about people who have lots of earthly successes, who may have the best business in the world, who may be millionaires, or in smaller senses may have just accomplished anything, you need to remember that this right to glory is nothing compared to Jesus' right to glory. So we must also lower ourselves and then obey. We must keep Jesus as our role model, because our role models are the only way that we can discern what humility means. So we should look to our great cloud of witnesses around us. We can look to Hebrews 11 and see a list of Old Testament figures who exemplify humility and the virtue of God and the life God has intended for us. I encourage you, all of us, to look at their stories, and as we talk about stories this year, to learn from the stories of the Bible, to see how they grew and how we can also grow. So back to Jesus. As the author and perfecter of our faith, Jesus perfected our faith by being exactly who we need to become. He wrote our faith by being himself perfect, and he allowed us to see, seek, and find the truth of life. He says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. We are called not simply to do the will of the Father, but to become his will, that by our nature we would honor him, that we would please and honor him in all that we do. He's our total example, and by doing that, by following him as our example, we also can become an example for others. Hebrews 12 says, for the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the Father. So consider him who endured such opposition from sinners, so that you will not grow weary in his heart.